Hello and welcome to this GCSE Biology Unit 7 virtual revision guide, and we're going to be looking at this entire module. Now this module is a big module, so you might want to do this video in 2 steps, but also you need to realise that this video will not cover everything you need to know because there's so much content in it. So to start off then, we're looking at something called recycling and decomposition. So recycling is something that has to happen in the natural world, because otherwise nutrients would just run out. So when organisms die, decomposers recycle them and they break the nutrients that are trapped inside the dead organism down, return them to the soil, so then they can be reabsorbed in plants and reused. Now when something dies initially, the first thing you might notice, that there's a dead animal on the road, is it be covered in maggots and flies and things like this. And these are organisms called detritivores, and they start to break down the organism into tiny bits. So then the decomposers, which are bacteria and fungus, they can then start decomposing them properly. And they use the nutrients. The reason the bacteria and fungus do it is they use the nutrients in the food to respire, which is giving them or releasing energy for them. And then as a result, they do release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which we'll talk about when we come on to the carbon cycle. Now, we'll often use, we can have in your garden, your parents might have compost heaps where we can do this. And compost heaps are often a popular question where it asks you in an exam, what are the optimum conditions for decomposition? Well, the optimum conditions are moisture, so liquids to help the cells live, the microbes live. Oxygen, because the microbes want to do aerobic respiration, which helps them break down the dead materials. And warmth, because they have enzymes like we do, so therefore they want to have this higher optimum temperature of above 37 degrees, let's say. The uses of decay, obviously compost heaps, such as I haven't put on here. Sewage breakdown is essential. It's increased our life expectancy, and that's using decomposition using different bacteria. And we can also use it to generate biogas or methane in small scales in isolated areas. And that would be used something like this. So what you could do on a farm is you can take the manure from a farm, which gets rid of the manure for you, put it into a biogas generator with lots of microbes in there, and you stir it. It has to be anaerobic. So what that means is no oxygen present whatsoever. So it has to be an airtight component. And when you do anaerobic decomposition, bacteria tend to produce methane. And that methane is then used, and it can be used to power generators or cookers in, say, remote places like farms that haven't got an electricity or gas supply. A key area of GCSE biology, which some people often overlook, is the water cycle. And the water cycle is a popular exam question because water is essential for all living things. And effectively, you need to know the stages of the water cycle. So, and what each keyword means. So if we start in the oceans, okay, the first thing that happens is the water in the ocean evaporates. So the heat from the sun warms up the ocean, and that water is turned to steam or to water vapor due to heating and the energy there. That water then cools down and it condensates back into water droplets or into liquid as it cools down in the clouds as it goes across the land. And then at some point, the water droplets get too much and too heavy, and they drop down to Earth during precipitation. So rain is precipitation. Now, once it's on the land, that water eventually returns to the sea, and it can do so in a couple of different ways. Obviously, it can go down in lakes and rivers. You can have something called surface runoff, or you can have infiltration. And infiltration, the word you need to know is percolation. Okay, and percolation is when the water moves through soil or through rocks. Now, if it's absorbed by plants, the plants do something called transpiration, which is covered in a different module, which is where they absorb water through the roots. It goes up through the xylem and is evaporated out of the stomata in the leaves of the plant. It means it would go back into the atmosphere and to form new clouds. So you need to know those key words, and you need to be able to describe that process of the water cycle. Another cycle which is absolutely essential for all life on Earth is the carbon cycle. And the carbon cycle is the movement and recycling of carbon through the ecosystem. And effectively, the carbon cycle is, if we start with carbon dioxide, which is a gas in the atmosphere, the only way it can be removed and taken into a living material is through the process of photosynthesis, which makes trees a carbon sink. And photosynthesis, as you know here, is when carbon dioxide reacts with water and uses the sun's energy to make glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen. So what we say is the carbon dioxide has become fixed into the glucose because you've got your carbon molecules there and your oxygen molecules there, and obviously some oxygen as well released. Now those plants then can be eaten by animals, okay, and the animals and the plants, which this diagram does show, sorry, I was about to say it doesn't, both respire, which release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So that then breaks the glucose down, releasing that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. And that's a nice, relatively nice balance. But also animals and plants die, and when they die, they do one of two things. They are decomposed, and when they are decomposed, the microbes themselves are respiring, as we talked about earlier, which returns more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. If they don't decompose properly, they might turn into fossil fuels over millions of years and be trapped away in that carbon sink until humans have come along and started burning the fossil fuels. So human impact is obviously really important, and we're big particular news these days. And it's happening because the human population has grown massively and it is still increasing exponentially, which means it is continuing to go up at a faster and faster rate. There are three major impacts we're having on the water, such as sewage is happening and toxins into the water, air, and land pollution. And you need to be very specific when talking about pollutions. So first type is land pollution, and land pollution basically is affecting the soil that we live on, it's affecting plants, and it's reducing biodiversity. So any time in biology you ever talk about anything to do with pollution or environment loss or things like this, always go back to it reducing biodiversity, which is the variety of living things in an ecosystem. And we're polluting our land through three things. We're using more and more landfills. Now, landfills are obviously poisonous to the land they're on, but they also release methane gas, which we'll talk about later on. Fertilizers and pesticides are also being used on farms, and that is having direct effects. It can poison different animals that we don't want it to poison, but also it can cause other things such as water pollution. So water pollution is a big one then. So there are lots of types of water pollution. Obviously you can put things we don't want in the water, such as oil, plastics, as you'll be aware of. But actually water pollution at GCSE focuses particularly on sewage and fertilisers happening, which in the UK is a massive, the fertilisers thing is a massive impact on the biodiversity of living organisms. So what happens is a process called eutrophication, and basically when fertilizers or sewage enter the water, they actually add a lot of nutrients in there, which increases the growth of algae. Now why is this a problem? Well, this is what happens, and you need to be able to talk your way through this. So the first thing that happens is fertilizers run into the lake off the farm, let's say. You get something called an algal bloom. So the algae grow huge numbers because they have all these nutrients, and they're the first things that can really get hold of those nutrients. This then blocks the sunlight out in the lake or river, and then the plants below it don't get any sunlight, and they can't do photosynthesis. So then less oxygen is available in the water because they're not doing photosynthesis, and then the aquatic life starts to die. And then as they die, it gets even worse because then bacteria and fungus decompose what's dying, and that uses up any last level of oxygen in the water. Another problem is acid rain, and acid rain is when rainwater's got a pH of less than 5.5. So normally rainwater's got a pH of about 6.5, so it is slightly acidic, but it's not a problem. 5.5 or lower is acid rain. And acid rain, you should know, is formed by fossil fuels being burned. And in the fossil fuels, we have impurities, often coal, particularly petrol, oil, has impurities of sulfur or nitrogen. And when they burn, the sulfur in the fuel burns, it reacts at high temperatures with the oxygen and it creates sulfur dioxide. If it's nitrogen, the exact same thing happens, but it forms nitrogen oxide, which we often describe as NOx because there can be different amounts of oxygen, but most commonly is NO2. And those gases then go into the air, they dissolve into the rainwater, and that makes either sulfuric acid in the case of sulfur dioxide, it makes nitric acid in the case of nitrogen oxide. And its impacts then, it lands on the plants and it can damage the leaves of plants, it can kill aquatic organisms, it can dissolve buildings that are made out of calcium carbonate rock or limestone, so it can have big impacts. We are trying to reduce its impacts by using low sulfur fuels. So if you go to petrol stations now, they'll often say sulfur-free petrol. We can have cleaning chimneys in power stations to remove the particulates, and we're trying to reduce combustion or reduce the use of diesel, which releases some of these things particularly, which is why you have like congestion charges now in like Birmingham city centre. And this directly again links to something called smog. Smog is a mixture of smoke and particulates trapped in fog. You can see London there and all the smog around London, and basically it can happen with certain weather conditions make it worse. There's no wind, the pollution builds up in the air in the city, and it can lead to global things such as global dimming, which means the less light gets in and therefore plants will be able to do less photosynthesis. But also directly it can have long and short-term effects on your health, particularly asthma is increasing as a result. If you have asthma, it can be made worse. People in cities alone more at a higher rate of lung cancer, and it's also been linked to stuff like strokes and things like that. So we know that smog particularly and all air pollution is bad for us. We're trying to reduce the amount of smog, and London used to have a big smog problem by using low sulfur fuels, trying to again use chimneys to remove the particulates, and also try and use congestion charges around the big cities. Global warming is one that you need to know about in all areas of science, and it's caused obviously by greenhouse gases. Now, I'm not going to go into massive detail here because it's not in biology curriculum, but you do need to know in physics that the gases such as carbon dioxide, methane are greenhouse gases. They insulate the planet, which means they allow UV radiation in, but infrared radiation cannot escape into space, and the global temperature is increasing as a result. Carbon dioxide is increasing due to the main activities of humans that are deforestation. So we're removing that source of photosynthesis, which could remove the carbon dioxide for us, and also burning the trees a lot to clear them as we do so. And we're also burning more and more fossil fuels. The other gas, methane, CH4, is increasing because they're produced by cattle, farting effectively, and we're doing huge numbers of cattle farming now. Rice releases it in the conditions that it's grown in anaerobic conditions, so it releases methane, and landfills also release methane. In the UK, we're not helping situations, although we're trying to stop this now, because peat bog has been removed, and peat is basically made up of this soil mixture made up of like half decomposed plants and animals, and because they're half decomposed, they store a lot of carbon, and therefore that doesn't get released as carbon dioxide, so they're a carbon sink. If we remove trees from the areas where these are, the sunlight can dry the peat up, and then the carbon dioxide gets released. And if we allow the peat to decay, it will release the carbon dioxide. For a while it's been used in gardens, and people put it on their garden because it really helps your garden flowers grow, but it was releasing huge amounts of carbon dioxide. And even some people burn it as a fuel because it burns really well and it's a cheap fuel. but again, when you burn it, it releases carbon dioxide. So we're trying to prevent that now and look after the peat in the UK, and it's also a problem in other parts of the world. Now, the problems of global warming and climate change are huge, but some of them linking to biology is it could cause a loss of habitat. So, for example, the Arctic ice melting, that would reduce biodiversity. It's affecting the migration patterns of things like birds because they're trying to find the right temperature climate. And again, if they can't find the right temperature climate, they're likely to die out. But also, if some migrate and some don't, there's less reproductive success, and therefore that is reducing biodiversity. Sea levels are changing, and that could increase, bring salt water into areas where there's fresh water. It could destroy coastal environments where there's lots of biodiversity, and again, that is reducing biodiversity. And extreme weather, such as fires, Australian fires wiped out half the koalas on the planet last year, and that is again reducing biodiversity. So the key point is everything is reducing biodiversity. There's one more which isn't on here, which I think is important, is it's actually increasing the spread of diseases through insects, which might be able to live in hotter climates. They've been able to travel more, and that could increase the spread of disease, which other than that insect would again decrease biodiversity. So you also need to know about food chains and a human food chain as well. And you need to be aware that obviously food chains are showing you what eats what, but effectively they're showing the energy flow for an ecosystem. And the arrows show the direction of energy flow. And here's an old question from a GCSE paper where you had to link up the different things. So in this case, the apex predator is the top predator, it's not eaten by anything else other than decomposes when it dies, and that is the large fish. The primary consumer is the first thing that is eaten, and is eating anything in the food chain, so that's the invertebrates. And the producer is the thing that produces the energy into the food chain, or makes the food, sometimes say, which is the algae. So if we go through, you should be able to call the algae a producer because it uses photosynthesis to produce glucose and starts the food chain producing food. Primary consumers, the first thing they eat, they're always herbivores because they're eating the plant, the producer. Small fish in this case is the secondary consumer. It is both a predator because it's eating the shrimp or whatever, and it's also a prey because it's been eaten by the larger fish. And then the apex predator is the larger fish. Now, whilst it's not on the food chain, don't forget when this fish dies, it will be decomposed, returning the nutrients back into the soil or into the water released in this example, and that can be absorbed by algae and plants in the ecosystem. Now, food chains are important and they can have big impacts if we don't look after them, because what can happen is toxins, so poisons, we talked about fertilizers earlier on, if they don't get broken down, or pesticides don't get broken down, some of them survive through the food chain and they can build up in something called bioaccumulation. So here we've got insects, which maybe we sprayed these bushes here with pesticides. The insects, the aphids feeding them, but they don't actually die, some of them survive. They get eaten by the smaller birds, the blue tits in this case. They don't die, but then when all three blue tits are eaten by the owl, the poison builds up, it accumulates, and it might be enough to poison the owl, or in this case, it might build up and affect the eggs of the owl so the offspring don't survive. You also need to be aware of something called biomass. Now, biomass is the total dry weight of a living organism. So what I mean by that is if we took this, let's say this fox, and we could put the fox in a big oven or a big kiln, and you could basically evaporate all the water from the fox, you would be left with what we call the biomass, the dry weight. And that is something we use that because different organisms at different times have different amounts of water in them, and it's easier to compare the dry mass of an organism. So the biomass is the total living or dry mass of an organism. And as you go through a food chain, it always decreases. So we have something called a pyramid of biomass. And a pyramid of biomass, if you were to compare the different amounts of biomass in a food chain, they would always decrease because only about 10% of the energy in each organism can get passed on to the next organism. So each time there's a massive energy loss that can be then turned into less and less biomass. And the reason that this energy isn't passed on and therefore the biomass decreases is because the energy gets used up by that living thing. So for example, if we're going from the stoat to the fox, the biomass wouldn't be 100%, or the energy isn't 100% passed on, because some biomass is lost as undigested food. It's not converted to energy or into new parts of the stoat. Some is lost as urea. Okay, so some of it's lost as feces, some of it's lost as urea. The stoat uses energy itself to keep warm, and it uses energy to move. So therefore, we don't pass on all that energy. And this explains in intensive farming why, if we're trying to intensively breed cattle, for example, we'll keep them often indoors because we want to be able to stop them using that energy to regulate their body temperature. And also we keep them tightly packed together so they can't move, and therefore they use less energy for movement. So the last part is human food chains and human food security. So human food security is, have we got enough food to feed the population? And the food security changes at different times in a population. So the factors that could affect or particularly lower the food security level of a country could be the birth rate. If there's a huge number of people being born all the time, there's the same amount of food, but more and more people. So therefore the food security would drop. The diets and demand of that area. So the world's diet is changing. More and more people want meat and fish and things like this, and there's more demand on certain food types, and that is causing a decrease in food security. The wealth of a particular country, so often poorer countries might grow the crop, but they sell it to the more wealthier countries, and therefore the people in the poorer countries may still have, even though they grow the crop, a lower food security. And then new diseases could come along, or that could be crops, so you get like a wheat failure or a harvest failure, and animal diseases could come and also kill off cattle, or something like TB, for example, and that can drop your food security. And obviously the climate change and global warming is increasing our problems with food security. It's decreasing the food security because even in the UK, we've had wet springs where therefore the crops fail because they don't grow very well. We've then had dry droughts, and therefore crops aren't used to those conditions, and that can affect our food security massively. Now, two areas you need to be aware of are firstly fishing. And fishing is an area which is massively unsustainable overall, and we're trying to make fishing, particularly in the UK, and it's a lot with Brexit and things like this has become big in the news, is we're trying to make it more sustainable through using fishing quotas, which is when we say basically you can catch this many tons of this species of fish a year, and if fishermen catch more than that, they wouldn't be allowed, when they come back into dock, they're checked, they wouldn't be allowed to sell it. And also there's something called bycatch. So you can see here in this picture, let's say that these little fish, these little sardine type fish here, are what we want to catch. We've got things in here we don't want to catch. So we've got sharks, we've got turtles, and we've also got birds and things like that. But generally any fish, whale there I suppose, we don't want to catch is a bycatch, and fishermen will just throw it overboard even if they're dead. So what they can do is increase the size of the nets that we use to catch, so the bycatch can escape from those nets, and change our fishing methods to avoid bycatch. Now, one area where there is a future in our food security which we've developed is the use of mycoprotein, which we'd often called corn in this country. And mycoprotein is a fungus which vegetarians often is obviously very popular with because it supplies a good level of protein which vegetarians might struggle to find because they don't have meat. So this meat substitute, or corn, has become very popular, and so it's a good source of protein. It's low or no cholesterol, so it doesn't affect, like, potentially give you heart disease in the future like certain meats do, particularly red meats. And effectively we can grow it on waste bits of plant. So how it works is the fungus is given a source of glucose, as I said, waste plants often. It reproduces in large fermenters like you can see here. It does it in aerobic conditions. So the way that we get those aerobic conditions, our oxygen is pumped in. and its temperature is controlled because using cool water, because it will respire as it grows and it will get too hot. Okay, and it's mixed with glucose, so it will grow nicely. Now, some people don't like corn or mycoprotein because it tastes bland. Some people don't like the fact that it's growing on waste plant material, but that is just literally bits of crop that we don't use. But its main benefit for people is it has a source of protein, and that is a healthy source of protein. And it was actually invented and come up with because they thought there was going to be a protein shortage in the world a few decades ago. And a lot of people think it will be a way to make food more sustainable into the future.